Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our talk, which is about how green a website can be. So my name is Sienna Svab. I'm a developer at BlueState. I actually came into the world of development through environmental science, specifically through GIS. So this presentation is near and dear to my heart. I'm super excited to link together my past and present work. And I get the joy of working at BlueState, which is an amazing mission-driven agency that works with organizations to build a progressive future. Our services range from developing campaigns for fundraising and advocacy to building websites. The heart of the work we do is making points of connection between an organization and their supporters, leveraging technology to achieve this goal.
I'm Doug Cohn, and I've been building the internet since the late 90s, and it's changed a ton since I started. It seems like it becomes ever more complex. I used to think that I did all of the internet and all of the full stack, and the more that I do, the more complex it gets and the deeper the rabbit hole goes. But today I get to work for Pantheon, where I work with edge cases and edge sites a lot. Pantheon is the leading web app platform enabling serverless CMS. Hey, Sienna, have you heard of non-fungible tokens?
Oh yeah, just last month, I remember this artist Beeple was in the headlines a ton for selling a record-breaking $69 million piece of digital art. What was super interesting, and you'll see in this slide, is following this auction, there were a ton of articles that came out around the environmental impact of NFTs, largely because blockchain consumes a ton of energy. And the artists that participate and use NFTs were super shocked and decided to reassess their use of that technology. In fact, just a few weeks ago, people did a carbon drop, a carbon neutral fundraising auction for Open Earth. I think what this recent set of headlines shows us is that in general, there's a big disconnect between how our digital behavior impacts the climate. In economist speak, basically our digital behavior is an externality. As we website people, Drupal people, actively create content and products in this space, it's our responsibility to better understand how our decisions impact the climate. And you might be thinking, I thought digital was green. We're not using paper anymore. We cut down less trees. But the reality is the impact of the digital world is real, large, and growing on the climate. In fact, some studies show that if the internet were an actual country, it's estimated that it would be the 7th largest polluting country in the world, equivalent or close to that of Germany. And its impact is growing. So let's see why. So our internet usage is increasing. It's estimated that nearly 2/3 of the global population will have internet access by 2023, up from just 50% in 2018. And in the US specifically, this fraction is even greater. In 2021, Pew Research estimated that 93% of the US adult population uses the internet, up from just 50% in the year 2000. Another thing that's contributing to the impact of the internet, particularly in the website realm, is the growth in page weight. So over the past decade, the average desktop page weight has increased over 300%, and the median mobile page weight has increased over 1,000%. A lot of this client-side bloat has been enabled by increased efficiencies in the network and hardware layers over the past 2 decades. But this efficiency increase is slowing. So you have 3 things at play here. Hardware efficiency gains are slowing, internet usage per capita globally is growing, and the cost or the data use of a single transaction with the internet is growing. So why does this matter? As hardware efficiency gains slow and computing demand and use increases, we need to find efficiencies in the layers where we work, the software layer. Essentially, more data means more electricity consumed and more carbon emissions.
We'd like to talk about our technology stacks, but how often do we think about our energy stack? Our view of a website just kind of tends to be that end user, that final result, and we probably don't even think about the monitor or the laptop that is displaying that website to end users. In general, a website consumes energy not only on the end user's device, but also the servers where it's hosted and the networks where it's transmitted across, as well as that end user device. Our industry accounts for more than 2% of global emissions. So that puts our carbon footprint on par with like the aviation industry's emissions from fuel. What is the environmental impact of a website?
So including the full system that makes the internet work and your web pages work, a typical page load of an average website produces approximately 3 grams of carbon dioxide emissions. So if you look at this as the number of page views per month, so at 10,000 page views per month, this would result in 360 kilograms of CO2 emissions per year, which is equivalent to the amount of carbon that can be sequestered by half an acre of US forest. So now that you have a better understanding of the impact of the internet and how this is happening, let's take a closer look at what you can do and what tools you can have to make your website greener.
Understand the steps that you can take and some of the different impacts. We're going to focus on 3 specific areas of the website, and we're going to start with hosting and infrastructure. We'll talk about design, and then we'll talk about development. So let's dive into hosting and infrastructure. I'm going to start by talking why this part of the stack matters, followed by some different considerations, as well as some approaches that you can take to make a difference at this layer. Most of us are aware of our choices of transportation and the impact that might have on the climate, like driving a car that comes with a direct cost, like every gallon of gasoline that I put into it. We often don't consider the infrastructure around it, like gas stations and tanker trucks and pipelines that are all needed to support driving a car. Much like driving a car, websites have a great deal of supporting infrastructure that we don't really consider when we consider looking at that website. So that leads us to a question: why does this infrastructure matter? And particularly in the case of websites, the easy answer is it's always on. If this wasn't a key feature, the internet might be really difficult to use, right? If you could only browse the internet between 8 and 5, we'd probably sleep better as a society, but we would also have a lot of things that we would miss out on and be unable to do. And so it's really important that our infrastructure makes websites available at all times of day. But it's also something that we want to leverage as a major factor in how our website uses energy. What considerations should you make about your infrastructure? Our traditional approach to technology has changed. And so these are some considerations as you select vendors or solutions for your infrastructure. But our approach has changed. In the early days of the internet, you had a monolithic approach where basically your IT manager went out and said, I need 3 servers with this kind of CPU and this much hardware for storage and so on and so forth. And I need those to be co-located in a data center for 3 years. And so I've got to buy extra servers because we don't know how much headroom we need and we don't know how much that website might have traffic 3 years from now. And so they had to estimate, usually overestimate, because it's hard to get, once you get approved for a budget, it's hard to get approved for more, right? And so they would overestimate and base that on potential traffic. Today's cloud infrastructure and our evolution to virtual machines has really allowed us to scale back on that over-provisioning, which is great. Then following on evolutions of that, like containers and serverless technology, are continuing to increase efficiency gains, where like containers are going to give you up to 1,000 times more efficient utilization of bare metal hardware than a virtual machine does. And so the pinnacle of that technology then is a serverless, which is a complete abstraction and something that takes all of the headaches away from managing any of the actual hardware. And this is really good news. Because of the increased efficiency and the increased use of the cloud, we're actually seeing data center energy remain very flat. And that's despite the continued growth. But it's something that we do definitely need to take in mind and consider as we're provisioning our own infrastructure. The good news doesn't even stop there. Major cloud providers are also really concerned about their carbon footprints. And so you'll see that AWS has committed using more renewable energy and reducing their carbon emissions by 2030. while even today, Microsoft and Google's clouds fully offset their power use by either purchasing renewables directly or with carbon offsets that they purchase in order to hit net zero carbon emissions today. Google's commitment is probably industry leading and then most impressive. They lead corporate purchasing, as you can see in this graph, and are building direct renewable sources for their data centers, and they continue to lead in various innovations around that. Interestingly, tech companies accounted for about half of global corporate renewable procurement in the last 5 years. Infrastructure also matters from the perspective of those core technologies that you're using to operate on it. So we've looked at some of the things that you might consider with regards to what the actual hardware is running, but infrastructure doesn't necessarily stop there. If your infrastructure doesn't support running the newest versions of PHP, for example, you can significantly impact your application performance and how much you can get out of the application performance. So if you're running really old version of PHP 5.6, you're getting almost 100 requests per second less for the same hardware than you're getting for like PHP 8. And even PHP 8 is 36 more requests per second than PHP 7.4. So chasing the latest and greatest is very valuable from a performance aspect, for sure. I think that's some of the main things to think about regarding infrastructure. And so design is our next area of focus.
So Brad Frost, the creator of Atomic Design, which some of you might be familiar with, once said, "Good performance is good design," and I'll add to that that it is also good for the planet. So the road towards how green a website can be at the end doesn't start with the tech stack or developers, but it starts at the design phase. So across the web, fonts, video, and imagery make up about, on average, 76% of a page's total weights. And the decision to incorporate this content, how it is, how big it is done at the design phase. So if you're a designer, consider this. Limit the fonts that you use. Use system fonts if you can. If you're using video, make sure you don't use things like autoplay, and keep your content short and effective. It'll save page weight moving down the chain. And if there's one area of focus, I'm sure we all know this, I know this as a front-end developer, it's images. So images on average take up about 65% of a page's weight. So if you can take an image off a page or make it scale appropriately and not a full bleed, as a designer, you can save a lot of bandwidth down at the user consumer end. So use images effectively, use SVG and CSS wherever possible, and limit the size of those images. Some other important things that designers care about anyway, but will also reduce energy consumption, is SEO, clear and concise content, and good UX. So all of these things will reduce the amount of time that your user spends trying to achieve a specific task. And this means of your website and the constituent side of your website. Another interesting thing to point out here is content expiration. So if you have content that's irrelevant, expired, and unused, take that off your website. People won't end up at it, and it doesn't need to be hosted anywhere. Another super interesting thing, as OLED screens become more popular, where basically a black pixel doesn't need to be turned on, you can actually save energy demand across different colors, and this is different for different colors. Darker tends to consume less, and obviously white consumes the most. Some interesting facts about OLED. So Google found that blue consumes 25% more energy than red or green. And another thing about OLED screens is it makes dark mode a thing that you should support. So make sure to do a design version that supports dark mode. It's good for your users, their devices, batteries, and the earth. And finally, there's a super interesting tool that you can use to put guardrails around yourself. With your team, design, developer, project managers, set a page weight budget. This basically means at the onset, or even if you're in the middle of a project, set a maximum page weight to not exceed. And this will make sure that you have a page weight that you're measuring against. So if you want to add an image to a page or a template, potentially you're having a conversation, we can add this, but we have to take off this video because we're exceeding our page weight budget, and that's going to be bad for the earth and also bad for our users because it's going to take them a lot longer to see this content. Another good thing about a page weight budget is it just encourages you to start measuring your page weight, and that's always good because you can't improve what you don't measure. Next, I'm going to go into development, which is the space that I occupy. As a React developer, I'm definitely do this, write a lot of the JavaScript. But JavaScript byte for byte is more expensive than other resources because you have to download it, parse it, compile it, and then finally execute it. This includes both the code that you are writing, so make sure you write good modular reusable code, but also the code that you bring into your sites through plugins, packages, and advertising and tracking scripts. So make sure you're paying attention to that stuff. Even if your Google Tag Manager, for example, is managed by an analytics team, make sure that there's conversations around how much processing or how heavy that is for a page. And there's also some pretty interesting tools like tree shaking that you can leverage to remove unused JavaScript from your final production bundle. And then Safari actually recently came out with something in WebKit that lets you actually look at the energy impact of your JavaScript and processing your main thread. And you can actually use it to kind of figure out where weak spots are in your code in terms of their heavy CPU usage. If your fans are on, it's not a good sign. So just like designers, there's assets that take up most of a page's weight, which are fonts, videos, and images. So make sure that for these things, you're using compression and you're using the most efficient modern file formats, and just use fallbacks if those aren't supported by some of the older browsers that you need to support. So web open font format can save about, I think it shaves off like 25% from TrueType font format, and Wolf 2 does the same. So these are super interesting and important things to use to make sure the page weight that you're creating is less. And just like design, if there's one area that you should focus on, it is on the image layer. Remember, it's on average 65% of your page's total weight. So you can make your JavaScript as performant as you want, but if you don't do anything with your images, your page is going to be super bloated. So make sure you're using compression and modern formats. There's interesting things in HTML5 that let you do fallbacks to support other browsers and to also scale images appropriately across different screen sizes. WebP, for example, is 26% smaller in comparison to PNGs and images. So make sure that you're using these. And there's a new one called AVIF that just came out that also provides some compression. So another thing to focus on is reducing redundant processes and data transmission by using things like static sites, AMP, server and client-side caching, progressive web applications, and CDNs. These will all prevent re-rendering processes from running and consuming energy, and they will also do a lot for your page's performance. So for example, progressive web apps, in comparison to native apps, are much smaller and can provide us the same experience, essentially. So Starbucks actually redid their native app as a progressive web app, and they found that it was 99% smaller and did all the same things that their native mobile app did. Another interesting things that CDNs offer, like right out of the box, just click a button, are things like gun zipping, image compression, using modern formats, and a CDN is closer to your user, so you're using less energy to transmit data across a network. So these are awesome tools to use to make your website more green. Another thing that CDNs do that is great is they block bad bots automatically. So there was a study that came out in 2019 from Imperva that found that 24.1% of all internet traffic is from bad bots. So these aren't your Google doing a crawl. These are malicious bots that harm web publishers and applications, hurt hosting providers by misusing resources, and they doubly hurt the planet through the cost of electricity for servers and cooling for their bots and their victims. In fact, 37.2% of all traffic wasn't human at all, including good and bad bots. So make sure that you're aware these bots don't hit your site. Another great thing that they do this will help you with on your analytics side is understanding your traffic better, because you're not getting these bot hits that are skewing your analytics.
So there's good news. Green is better for everybody. You can save money, so you're reducing your costs and infrastructure. You're getting a more performant website, so you're actually hopefully selling more or converting more, which, you know, it's always easier to convince the boss to do something when it makes them more money, right? Always something that's worth considering. But the final thing is that you're reducing your impact on the environment. And so all of these different things are going to be really good approaches, but you're probably wondering where a good place to start is.
So here's a list of things that you can do today. So there's this awesome tool made by Whole Grain Media called the Website Carbon Calculator, where you can put in your page today and it will tell you an estimate of how much carbon emissions it is creating. There's tools like the Performance Budget Calculator, which will let you input like how much CSS, how many images you want, and set up a page weight budget. There's an awesome foundation called the Green Web Foundation that does a lot of work behind the scenes to figure out how clean hosting providers are. And they have an amazing API and data set that you can look at and use to see if the hosting providers that you're using today are actually sustainable and what their practices are. And then finally, make your green website love public. Sign the Sustainable Web Manifesto to show your support for a greener web. So thank you so much for joining our presentation, and please feel free to drop any questions into the live chat.
So I see Sean's question in the Q&A is, what do you think the optimal JPEG quality percent that has the best balance between quality and size is? That's kind of a tricky one. I think typically that's going to vary a little bit by the type of content that you're using. Typically, I fiddle with it in a tool and try different compression ratios to see what I can get away with. There are some automated tools. You probably, when you use an automated tool, are probably going to skew a little bit less optimized because some of your images may come through more grainy than others. There are a lot of tools that you can do in Photoshop or the various different editing tools out there that can give you different color palettes, and there's way extreme levels of optimizations that you can do if you're familiar with the tools and take it beyond sort of that automatic, what percent should I save it at? But I think unless Sienna has other input, it typically is going to vary a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just trying to do compression to begin with, I mean, I always use tiny PNG. That's something that both like designers and developers are familiar with, and it's pretty efficient at like stripping unneeded information from JPEGs and PNGs. But yeah, I think the other thing with images beyond just like compression and encoding them efficiently is just like scaling those to the width that they're actually going to be used, and that's like less frequently of a focus of developers, and it can be tricky definitely on front ends that are like super fluid. But I would plug that as a thing that I always need to do better than most others do.
A lot of times, especially if you deal with user-generated content that you don't have any control over, I'll recommend tools that do that at the CDN. I think Stiana mentioned, what was it, Tiny PNG, or which one was the Tiny?
Tiny PNG is a plugin for a ton of things. I know Cloudflare has like automatic image compression at the CDN layer, and a lot of the CDNs have like edge functions that you can also plug into if you want to get creative and kind of build out your own compression layer at the edge of your CDN cache. There's also CDNs that, or not CDNs, there's CMSs that have like image APIs that you can leverage and plug into to create.
Yeah, I think I tend to lean on the edge layer, especially if it's user-generated content. We have a product that does automatic WebP images if the browser supports it and things like that, and that tends to be my recommendation. So the next question we have is from Cecilia, and it's, what software do you gravitate towards for creating next-generation file formats, especially if you're not using Adobe products?
So for compression and like file formatting, if I'm touching them, there's a lot of packages out there. They should be in our resources that you can use to run these in the command line. I'm trying to remember some of the node packages that I use just as like a front end developer. But I also use some CMSs that like have this out of the box in their image API layer, and that makes my job super easy because I just put the right query parameter on an image API for like Contentful's API, for example, and it does it for me.
Yeah, I would second that. Finding a node utility that you can put into your CI/CD process and automate any of that, or an API that you can query. I know there's some commercial APIs that you can drop in to generate the automate. Instead of letting Drupal generate images, you can let their APIs generate them, and they'll do it more efficiently and things like that.
Yeah, another thing to note in this space is SVGs are a thing to also optimize, and there is a node package called SVGO that you can run through in your CI layer to optimize your SVGs before they're pushed to the front end. So that's a good tool for sure.
So Anna asks, any Drupal specific ideas besides image sizes and formats?
So, I mean, I think the biggest things out of Drupal that you can do are obviously upgrade to the latest versions of PHP. I think the server-side caching is also super important. So using tools like Varnish to make sure that when you're querying your CMS, you're not doing that more than you need to because content hasn't gotten stale. And also Drupal, if you're interested in static sites, Drupal has moved towards headless CMSs and can be used as the backend for things like Gatsby to build static sites. So it can be a super powerful CMS behind a static site as well, which tend to be more performant and also more secure on the front end.
And any tool to measure green results between the original and the optimized result of a migration to different technologies, stacks, CMS, infrastructure, etc.
So, I mean, I guess this is it a different URL? So there are tools. There's a tool called EcoPing that you can like basically set up the same way you would set up other things testing your website to make sure they're up to hit a URL at a given frequency and like keep testing it. But obviously it would need like 2 points of comparison. There's also a tool called sitespeed.io, and it has a sustainability plugin that you can use and run at the command line level if you had something locally that you wanted to test 2 versions of a site. But yeah, I think a lot of the tools are obviously in the browser, so you would need different URLs. I think sitespeed.io is a good option if you have like a local instance that you wanted to compare.
Even just doing Lighthouse scores on the before and after is an easy place for anybody to start and get at least a generic benchmark. And obviously you can dive a lot deeper into that too, but you can just take it to the simple before and after of a Lighthouse score. I know some projects that I've worked with recently are doing that. They're reporting the Lighthouse score on every pull request so that they know how bad things are going in one direction or the other.
I also know that the web dev tool that Google came out with for their like core vitals, you can put a URL in there and like sign up through your email and have it be like a thing that they keep, and you can keep re-hitting from a public URL and see how you're doing with the specific metrics, which a big part of it is Lighthouse, but the ones that they measure.
Cool. Any specific Drupal modules that you think of?
Doug, do you have any that you would use?
No, I think pretty much everything I would use. I of course tend to lean more to the back end, so I'm more interested in tools like New Relic or Blackfire for like profiling the performance of a site, and of course those aren't modules, so you can't just install it into the site and get it to work the same way you can a module specifically. Anything that helps you cache your site or leverage the Drupal cache better than what you do now is going to reduce your overall resource usage for the site, and so that's definitely something that I would do. But specific modules offhand, I don't have any answers for that one.
There's a Pantheon question for you, Doug.
Yeah. So
does Pantheon fastly optimize images by default for sites?
We do not. We do cache them automatically, but we do not do any optimizations to them automatically. We usually have to work with the customer a bit to fine tune and tailor that to their specific use case. So yeah.
Doug's probably very excited because that's where he operates to get a Fastly question.
So Andrew asks, I feel like this software trend is to make everything abstract and object-oriented. Do you foresee more web tech going closer to lower stack levels like C or assembly to get quicker and more efficient? Yeah, I think I'll let Sienna chime in as well, but I think there's definitely a trend to some of this. There are some bleeding edge things in like the Elixir world where they're doing really crazy stuff that abstract things in really unique and interesting ways, and run almost decoupled processes in a sense. I think certainly we'll see more of that. I think the other trend is that we will see more and more efficiency in the languages that are easier to make more accessible. So I think we'll see more abstraction for sure, but I think we're also going to see more page builders and more experiences that open up the creative process to people that don't have as much of a background in design or development, because obviously Sienna and I are bottlenecks to people that don't have our skill set getting their things onto the web. So I think you're going to see both trends. I think you're going to see the tools that we use as developers get closer and closer to the hardware, at least to certain layers of abstraction. You can today, one of the advancements that I would tell you if you wanted to get really crazy is to go write modules for PHP that do specialized processing. So if you have some sort of special task that your website needs to do, but it's taking a lot of CPU or cycles in PHP, you might write that in C or Rust or Go and add that as a module into PHP and basically give yourself an API that you trigger that leverages that lower level machine level type code, but it allows the developers of the rest of the site to use PHP just like they're using today. So you see a lot more of those types of abstractions, I think, for sure.
Cool, yeah, I feel like my layer always gets in trouble for overuse of messy JavaScript. So I'm definitely like not using C. But yeah, I think that, I mean, you've seen a lot of the libraries and even like the CSS libraries going towards things that are cleaner. I mean, moving even just like looking at what was there with jQuery. Definitely getting efficient and object-oriented and more modular. And like, I still think JavaScript probably has a ways to go and improvements to make in that space because you can do crazy stuff. in the browser right
And we
now.
have no time to get into WebAssembly, which is the idea of using like native machine code in the browser where you can write a Go or C application and then the browser can run it on the local client, which is, yeah, we could talk about that for a while. Catch me in another session or something and we'll chat more about that for sure. So Shannon says, can we share the slides? Yes, we're going to share those. I'm not sure how we're going to get those out there, but we will definitely be sharing the slides in some fashion or another. So keep your eyes out for that. And then Mike says, any chance Fastly will be running on green servers like Google Cloud is? I don't have any insight into their roadmap for green stuff. I know we've asked them about that some before, and I'm sure that's on their radar as they move forward, but I don't have any specific insight into that.
Yeah, I would say that even like in the CDN side, I've seen a lot of companies coming out more recently with their green strategies and like more forward thinking. It seems to be the idea of thinking like of energy consumption and energy efficient in the CDN layer is definitely becoming more popular. So I feel like there is a blog piece from Fastly on their plans. There's also one from Cloudflare.
I think their challenge is they don't build their own data centers. They co-locate, which is really good for you and I because it means they can be in more data centers and be closer to us, but they don't have as much control over the infrastructure that they're utilizing at that layer. So that'd be my assumption, is that they're constrained by the fact that Google's giant and builds their own data centers. Fastly's really big, but they're not Google big. So I think that's probably a constraint as well. So Robert asks, has energy efficiency been considered as a Drupal initiative? I don't think so. I haven't heard anything about it. That would be probably outside of my realm of expertise. Someone else may know, but I'm going to assume no, since I haven't heard anything about it.
Okay. Any more questions? No. Just as an FYI, I shared a tweet from BlueState that links to a bunch of resources that we mentioned in this presentation. If you are curious about looking at these things right now, and we haven't figured out where our slide deck's going to be yet, I would say go look at those. There's a really cool company. They're WordPress based, but there's a really cool company in the UK called Wholegrain Digital, who's been doing a lot of work in this space for a long time, and Mighty Bytes also. So I would say look them up and get their information. I think they're super interesting people in this space, and I want to give them credit for looking at this stuff for the past like 10 years. Oh, Sam said the slides will be posted here. Thank you, Sam. Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming and attending this remote session in this time. It was super awesome to interact with everyone and excited to see other presentations at DrupalCon.
Bye, everyone.